Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling something pretty heavy. We're doing a deep dive into source material that tries to map out, well, the ultimate conflict, the prophetic timeline of World War III. And just to be clear up front, we're not speculating based on today's headlines. This is all drawn from very specific interpretations, heavily leaning on books like Ezekiel, Daniel, and especially the book of Revelation with all its symbolic sequences.
That's right. The material we were given, it really zooms in not just on if a third world war might happen, but exactly when and why it supposedly must happen in the sequence of final events. These sources are laser focused on prophetic chronology, the timing. So our mission today really is to lay out the core question. According to these interpretations, when is World War III set to occur? And maybe more importantly, what's its ultimate purpose? Why does it happen in this grand prophetic story?
Right. And it's crucial, I think, for everyone listening to grasp the framework here before we jump in.
Yeah.
Our whole discussion today, it's built on reading these biblical events, the seals, the trumpets, the beasts, as actual specific geopolitical and military moments that lead up to a final single world power. It's like mapping ancient prophecy onto a future potential conflict.
Yes, and because of that, we absolutely have to stress this point. The source material gets deep into theology, right? It deals with interpretations of some really potent religious and global political ideas, things like the Babylon harlot and the beast government. So our approach today is strictly to report on what these specific interpretations claim. We're here as impartial guides, trying to show you the logic inside the source material itself. We're not endorsing the theology or the politics, just laying out the interpretation.
Okay, good. So impartiality noted. Let's start with the why, the theology behind it all. The sources lay down this fundamental idea. War isn't random. It doesn't just happen. It needs divine permission, and it serves a purpose, usually as judgment for sin. They bring up verses like 1 Samuel 17.47, the battle is the Lord's. The idea is that war can be an instrument of judgment.
Exactly. And that premise is vital because it instantly changes how you look at something like World War III. In this view, it's not just a geopolitical accident, human error or ambition run wild. It's divinely permitted judgment. And to show this isn't a new idea, the sources use a really detailed historical parallel, the way ancient Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar attacked ancient Judah.
The Babylon-Judah parallel. And they get really specific about it, don't they? Showing judgment isn't always one big strike, but comes in stages.
Very specific. They focus on, well, essentially 4 key moments or waves. First, Daniel gets captured. That's in Nebuchadnezzar's first year ruling Jerusalem. Then a more severe attack in the 7th year. That's when Ezekiel and Mordecai are taken. Then the big one. 18 years and total destruction. The city, the temple, Judah as a nation gone. And there was even a final smaller exile mentioned 4 years after that, in the 23rd year.
Okay, so multiple steps, increasing intensity. How does that ancient history become a prophecy for us, according to these sources?
Well, that sequence, Babylon attacking Judah, is seen as a perfect template, a prefigurement. Ancient Judah was judged, the sources argue, because it had fallen into deep spiritual and moral decay, apostasy. So this historical pattern becomes a prophecy. The end-time power, called Great Babylon, this global political religious system, will attack the modern apostate Christian church, which the sources controversially labeled a church turned Babylon.
So the idea is that the perceived spiritual corruption within the modern church guarantees a similar multi-stage judgment, delivered by a great sword. And this is where the 20th century comes into play.
Right. The source material makes a direct leap. It identifies World War I and World War II as the first and second great swords. The first 2 judgments delivered on this church turned Babylon for its perceived wickedness. Even though history books see them as, secular power struggles, nationalism, and so on, this theological interpretation sees them as God allowing these massive wars to judge or purify corruption within global religious structures.
Okay, I need to push back on that a bit, based on the source's own logic. If WWI and WWII were the first and second swords, why weren't they World War III? I mean, they were horrific global conflicts. What was missing? What stopped them from being the final war that brings in this beast government?
That's a really sharp question, and the sources address it, maybe implicitly, through the specific details needed from Revelation's prophecies. There are 2 main things missing. First, WWI and WWII, devastating as they were, didn't cause the specific death toll mentioned early in Revelation, the death of 1/4 of the entire globe. That specific faction is seen as a prerequisite for the famine and plague of the third and fourth seals that follow.
Ah, the scale wasn't quite right, prophetically speaking.
Exactly. And second, maybe even more crucially, those wars, while they definitely shattered the old world order, didn't result in a single unified global power structure. The beast government led by the harlot, which is prophesied to rule for a very specific period, 42 months. That didn't happen after WWI or WWII.
Okay, so they were judgments, massive ones, following that escalating pattern from Babylon, Judah. But they didn't sort of clear the board enough for the final player, the beast, to take complete control globally. They didn't break the nation-state system entirely.
Precisely. They were like divine warnings or perhaps preliminary judgments using the sword. Huge, terrible judgments. But they lacked the specific, final, devastating impact needed to kickstart that final 42-month prophetic clock.
Which leads directly to the implication. If two swords have struck.
Then the next one, the third great sword, must be World War III. And it has to be the one that fulfills all the remaining prophetic conditions. This makes WWIE, in this framework, a necessary, maybe unavoidable event. An event that has to utterly smash national sovereignty worldwide to set the stage for that final global power.
Okay, so the why is established that it's judgment following a pattern. Now, the when. This is where the sources apparently disagree quite fundamentally, right? A major debate.
A huge debate. It's really the core conflict within the interpretation. There are two main viewpoints, and they are mutually exclusive, about when exactly WWIEI starts within that final 7-year period, the last week.
A fork in the prophetic road.
You could say that. Both views use strong arguments based on the text of Revelation. But, and this is really important, while they argue about the starting gun, they completely agree on the outcome. Both timelines end with unimaginable global devastation, which then allows for the immediate setup of this worldwide beast government. A system controlled, according to the sources, by this entity they call the Babylon Papacy, or the Babylon Harlot.
Okay, let's tackle the first possibility. Viewpoint 1. World War III starts early, right at the second seal.
Yes. Viewpoint 1 focuses intensely on Revelation 6, verses 3 and 4. When the second seal is opened, out comes a red horse. Its rider is given two things, a great sword and the authority to take peace from the earth, leading people to kill each other. The interpretation here is very direct. That great sword is World War III. It begins right then.
So under this view, the war itself is the trigger. It's the event that unleashes all the subsequent chaos described in the seals, the beginning of sorrows.
Absolutely. The Second Seal War kicks off the whole catastrophic chain reaction. War naturally leads to destroying resources, infrastructure, causing drought, which results in the massive global famine of the Third Seal, the Black Horse. Then the malnutrition, the breakdown of sanitation, the chaos that breeds widespread disease, epidemics. That's the Fourth Seal, the Pale Horse, whose rider is death. And the cumulative effect of just these first 4 seals, starting with the war, is staggering. The sources state it results in the death of 1/14 of the entire Earth's population.
A quarter of humanity. Killed by the sword, famine, plague, even wild beasts, it says, right?
Yes, the text is specific. Sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts. And on top of the death toll, the sources also mention that about 1/3 of the planet itself, land, vegetation, maybe water, becomes desolate or unusable due to the conflict and its immediate after effects.
Okay, if the war starts that early at the second seal and causes that much initial destruction, what does that mean for the famous 200 million horsemen? They show up much later at the sixth trumpet. How do they fit into this early war timeline?
That's a key interpretive point for viewpoint 1. In this scenario, the 200 million strong army is not the force that starts WWIE. The war has already been raging. The first quarter of humanity is dead. Instead, this massive army arrives later, at the sixth trumpet, as the force that ends the war between nations. Their specific action is described as a systematic massacre or slaughter. They kill an additional 1/3 of the remaining people on Earth. This final, devastating blow completely crushes any remaining national resistance and ensures the beast can take over.
Wow. Okay, so the sequence for viewpoint 1 is WWIE week begins, second seal. Causes massive death, 14, famine, plague. Much later, the 200 million horsemen arrive, sixth trumpet. They deliver the final killing blow, another 13 die. The beast steps into the vacuum and takes global control. The war is the initial catalyst.
Correct. It opens the floodgates. The horrors that follow soften up the world, create the instability. Then the 200 million horsemen deliver the coup de grace, the final push that transitions the world into that prophesied unified beast rule.
Okay, that's one possibility. Now let's flip to the other side. Viewpoint 2. This one argues the real World War III doesn't kick off until much later at the sixth trumpet. So how do they explain the second seal then? If that's not WWIEI, what is it?
Viewpoint 2 interprets the second seal differently. They see the Great Sword and the taking of peace not as full-blown WWIEI, but as the beginning of sorrows. Meaning, it represents widespread, perhaps intense, but still localized or regional wars, terrorism, civil conflicts maybe. Enough chaos to cause the famine and plague and the death of the first quarter, yes, but not the defining ultimate global war itself. That, they argue, is reserved for the sixth trumpet.
So the second seal sets the stage, creates the atmosphere of violence and instability.
Exactly. It weakens the world order, creates the necessary fear and desperation. Then the true World War III, the one that brings about the final transition, begins with the sounding of the sixth trumpet, as described in Revelation 9.14. This trumpet blast results in the unleashing of 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates.
And the release of these angels is immediately tied to the appearance of that colossal army, the 200 million horsemen.
Yes. This is the absolute core argument for Viewpoint 2. That 200 million strong cavalry, appearing right after the angels are unbound, is given a very specific mission to kill 1/3 of mankind. The sources backing this view argue forcefully, what else besides a truly global, all-out world war could possibly kill 1/3 of the entire human race in a relatively short period? Therefore, they conclude, this 200 million strong army must be the instrument of WWIU. That action is the war.
That logic seems compelling in terms of the sheer scale of death, 1/3 of humanity. That definitely sounds like a World War level event. But it brings up that question again, is what this army does really a war in the traditional sense, nations fighting nations? Or is it more like a one-sided slaughter, a massacre, as Viewpoint 1 suggests they carry out at the end? Does Viewpoint 2 address this?
It's a point of internal discussion even within Viewpoint 2 sources, actually. Some argue it must be a war. Maybe this massive force represents a unified bloc, perhaps Eastern powers, fighting against the rest of the world, resulting in mutual annihilation on a scale that kills 1/3. Others lean towards slaughter or massacre, suggesting a more targeted, perhaps even supernaturally empowered judgment executed by this force upon the wicked globally. But, at the end of the day, whether you label it war or massacre, the result described in the text is identical. 1/3 of mankind dies. And for Viewpoint 2, the sheer magnitude of that event makes it World War III, regardless of the precise mechanics. It's the defining moment of destruction.
Okay, so Viewpoint 2's sequence looks like this. The second seal brings preliminary conflicts, chaos, famine, plague, killing the first 14. This creates the volatile atmosphere. Then, bam, the sixth trumpet sounds, the 200 million army is unleashed, and that is World War III, violently killing another 13. And this devastation immediately precedes the beast stepping in to take control.
That's the timeline. The second seal is the warm-up act, however horrific. It sets the global stage, weakens national governments, wears people down. The sixth trumpet is the main event, the final, catastrophic conflict that obliterates any remaining concept of independent nations and delivers the death toll required. After that level of destruction, the world is supposedly so traumatized and broken that it readily accepts the beast's offer of a new world order.
It's a stark difference in timing. One puts the main event at the start of the sorrows, the other as the climax right before the final act. How do the source materials handle this? I mean, they're interpreting the same book. Do they just agree to disagree, or does one view tend to win out?
It's often presented as an ongoing interpretive debate. You know how theological studies can be. Sometimes sources will acknowledge both possibilities, maybe suggesting the truth involves elements of both. Perhaps WWISI is a process that starts escalating at the second seal, but reaches its truly defining, world-altering climax with the specific actions of the 200 million horsemen at the sixth trumpet. The key agreement, though, is that the massive death toll happens, and the sixth trumpet event involving that huge army is absolutely pivotal. Whether it starts the war or ends it, that army's action, killing 13, is what finalizes the conditions for the beast's rise. So the sixth trumpet is crucial either way. It's like arguing if the first round or the final round knockout defines the boxing match. Both are essential parts of the fight.
Okay, let's zoom in on that sixth trumpet then, because the details given are really vivid and strange. The 200 million horsemen, the Euphrates River, it sounds very specific.
Oh, the imagery in Revelation 9 is incredibly potent. It's meant to be unforgettable, terrifying. The source material digs into the description of this 200 million strong army. The writers have these breastplates, fire red, hyacinth blue, sulfur yellow, but the real focus is on the horses, or what they represent. They have heads like lions, and from their mouths comes the actual killing power, fire, smoke, and sulfur or brimstone. The text explicitly says this is what kills the third of mankind.
Heads like lions, mouths spewing fire, smoke, sulfur. That doesn't sound like biological horses at all. What do the sources think this is describing in, say, modern terms?
Right, this is where the interpretation gets very direct, mapping the ancient imagery onto potential modern or even future military tech. The consensus in the sources is that this can't be literal cavalry, it's symbolic language. The heads like lions are often interpreted as representing heavily armored vehicles, tanks, perhaps advanced mobile missile platforms, something imposing and powerful. The most direct link is the fire, smoke, and sulfur coming from their mouths. This is almost universally interpreted as representing advanced weaponry.
Like what? Missiles? Artillery?
Could be massive artillery barrages, guided missile systems, yes. But the combination, especially the sulfur, many sources strongly suggest this points towards chemical weapons or even tactical or strategic nuclear weapons. Fire, smoke, and sulfur, that's a pretty good description of the immediate aftermath of a nuke or large-scale chemical deployment.
That's chilling. The scale 200 million suggests something beyond any single nation's current arsenal, maybe. A coalition.
The sources suggest it's likely a unified single force or a massive coordinated coalition, something capable of projecting this devastating power globally. And then there's that other bizarre detail. Their tails are like serpents with heads, and they cause harm. Speculation there ranges from things like secondary weapon systems, maybe drone swarms launched from the main units, or perhaps representing the lingering effects, radiation, biological contamination, long-term environmental poisoning that continues to harm after the main attack. The point is, this force is depicted as being uniquely equipped for mass destruction on an unprecedented scale.
Okay, let's shift to the location mentioned, the Euphrates River. 4 angels are bound there. If we take viewpoint 2 seriously, that the war starts here, does that mean a literal war starting in the Middle East?
That's the initial, most literal reading, especially for viewpoint 2 proponents. If the Euphrates in Revelation 9 is the actual river flowing through Turkey, Syria, Iraq, then yes, it points to a potential trigger point for WWII in that very volatile region, a region that includes the land of ancient Babylon and Persia, modern Iraq and Iran. It has obvious geopolitical significance.
But you mentioned the sources raise a challenge to the literal interpretation, based on a later mention of the Euphrates.
Yes, and it's a strong challenge. It comes from Revelation 16, verse 12, during the sequence of the bowl judgments, which happen later. There, the 6th bowl is poured out, and the Euphrates River dries up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Now, the sources generally interpret these kings from the east not as human armies, but as Christ and his heavenly spiritual army coming for the final battle of Armageddon.
Okay, so what's the argument?
The argument is, would Christ's heavenly army, a spiritual force, actually be stopped by a physical river? Would they need it to dry up before they could cross? The logical answer seems to be no. A spiritual army wouldn't be hindered by a physical obstacle like that.
Right, so if the drying up in Revelation 16 is symbolic.
Then the Euphrates itself, in that context, must be symbolic. The sources often link it to the historical defenses of ancient Babylon. Remember, King Cyrus conquered Babylon partly by diverting the Euphrates River, weakening its defenses. So the drying up of the Euphrates in Revelation 16 is interpreted symbolically as the dismantling of the spiritual and political defenses of Great Babylon, the harlot system, clearing the way for Christ's final judgment. And if the river is symbolic in Revelation 16,
then it's likely symbolic back in Revelation 9 as well, where the 4 angels are bound.
That's the strong suggestion. It means the angels aren't tied to a specific spot in Iraq, but rather to a symbolic constraint. A constraint related perhaps to the power or influence of Babylon, which, when removed, unleashes these forces of global war.
Interesting. So what about the 4 angels themselves, bound at this symbolic Euphrates? Who or what are they?
The sources connect them thematically to the 4 winds mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel, the 4 winds blow upon the great sea, representing the nations, and cause the 4 great beasts, representing world empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, to rise. So the function of these winds, or angels when unleashed, seems to be to stir up massive global conflict and upheaval, which facilitates the rise of dominant world powers or beasts.
So are these angels actual national leaders, like the Prince of Persia mentioned in Daniel 10, or something bigger?
The interpretation tends to favor something bigger, more powerful than just individual national spirits. Because their release affects the whole world, leading to the death of a third of mankind, they're often seen as high-ranking fallen angels, perhaps principalities, whose role has been to restrain or regulate global warfare. holding back the final all-out conflict until the precise moment in God's prophetic timetable.
So their release is the permission slip for maximum global violence.
Essentially, yes. When these restraining forces are unbound at the sixth trumpet, the immediate result is the eruption of violence, WWIEI, whether you see it starting then or just climaxing that kills the required one-third. This act is the final decisive event that shatters the old world order and allows the final beast power to consolidate absolute global control. It ends the era of competing nations fighting each other.
Which brings us to the aftermath. The war, however it starts and climaxes, achieves its purpose. Utter devastation. The sources say a quarter dead, then a third of the rest dead, a third of the planet desolate. What rises from those ashes?
What rises is exactly what the devastation was designed to allow: a single global authority. The sources are absolutely clear. The world is left so traumatized, so exhausted, so desperate for any kind of order that it readily accepts a new form of global governance. This new regime is depicted through two interconnected figures: the harlot and the beast she rides upon.
The harlot representing the political religious driving force.
Yes, the sources often identify her directly with the term Babylon papacy or Babylon harlot. Revelation 17 gives that vivid description. She's dressed in purple and scarlet, gold, precious stones, pearls, symbols of immense wealth, royalty, and often associated historically with the Roman papacy. She holds a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication, representing false doctrines and spiritual corruption. And her name, written on her forehead, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth.
And the most chilling part of her description: drunk with the blood of the saints. What does that signify for this period?
It signifies a crucial shift. The period of global warfare between nations, WWIIE, is over. The conflict now becomes internal, focused. The primary activity of this harlot-led system is the systematic persecution and martyrdom of those who remain faithful to God, those who refuse to comply with the new global order. She rides the beast, meaning this religious political ideology is in control, directing the secular power.
And the beast provides the enforcement, the global infrastructure of control.
Exactly. The beast, described with 7 heads, 10 horns, blasphemous names, represents the actual governmental, military, and economic power structure. Revelation 13 says it's given authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. Now, the sources clarify this doesn't necessarily mean all nations physically merge into one superstate. They might retain some identity, like the iron mixed with clay in Daniel's statue. But their sovereignty becomes meaningless. They all fall under the absolute totalitarian control of this single beast system.
And this period of unified global control isn't indefinite. There's a very specific time frame mentioned.
A very specific and crucial time frame: 42 months. The beast is given authority to act, to rule for exactly 42 months, which is equivalent to 12,260 days or 3.5 prophetic years. This period marks the beginning of the last week, the final 7 years of this age, according to Daniel's prophecies. And it's vital to understand the world during these 42 months experiences a kind of peace, but it's a false peace.
How so? False peace.
Well, the devastating world war is over. Nations aren't fighting each other anymore. There's stability, but it's an enforced totalitarian stability. The conflict doesn't disappear, it just changes focus entirely. It shifts from international war to internal suppression. The primary global activity becomes the hunting down and killing, the sources use the word massacre, of God's people, the Great Tribulation.
So the end of WWIEOB isn't relief, it's the start of a different kind of horror. An enforced global tyranny where the only enemy is religious dissent.
That's precisely the picture painted. The war breaks the world. The trauma paves the way for acceptance of the beast's authority in exchange for order. And once that Babylon harlot system cements control and enforces the worship of the beast, international warfare ceases. The final 42 months, the 12,260 days of intense spiritual persecution, begin. That massive death toll from the war and its aftermath is the trigger that starts this final countdown.
Okay, but even in this bleak picture of total control and persecution, the source material talks about resistance, doesn't it? A protected group, a remnant.
Yes, absolutely. It's a key part of the narrative divine protection amidst judgment. The sources point to Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4. Before the worst of the judgments really hit, whether that's the second seal war or the sixth trumpet war, God sends a figure to place a mark, a seal, on the foreheads of certain people. These are the ones who sigh and cry over all the abominations being committed, particularly within the professing church itself. This sealing is for protection.
And why is mourning over in the criterion? Not fighting back, but grieving.
It emphasizes that protection isn't earned by outward strength or action, but by inner spiritual state. These are the people who genuinely recognize and grieve the deep spiritual corruption and apostasy around them, both in the church and the world. Their grief marks them as spiritually distinct from the system being judged. It aligns them with God's perspective. And so they are marked for preservation, echoing the idea that judgment begins at the house of God, but spares the truly faithful within it.
And this marked protected group is specifically identified as the 144,000.
Yes, the sources directly link this sealing in Ezekiel to the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation, particularly chapter 7 and 14. They are called the firstfruits, the initial harvest of the truly faithful. They receive a special anointing of the Holy Spirit, often called the latter rain outpouring. This empowers them not just for survival, but for the spiritual tasks ahead during the beast's reign. They are the protected remnant.
Now, bringing back the timing debate, when does this sealing happen relative to WWII? Does it depend on which viewpoint you take?
It does create a slight chronological difference. If you follow viewpoint 1, WWIEE, starts at the second seal, then the sealing likely happens after the war has begun, as the initial judgments are unfolding, maybe around the time of the sixth seal events, which depict martyrs and cosmic signs. But if you follow viewpoint 2, WWIUI is the sixth trumpet event, then the sealing happens before the main war breaks out. Specifically, it's often placed during the events of the sixth seal, which immediately precedes the seventh seal opening, which then leads to the trumpets. Either way, the sealing occurs just before or during the most intense period of global destruction, ensuring their protection through it.
And this protected group, the 144,000, they don't just disappear, do they? The sources connect them to the two witnesses mentioned later in Revelation.
Exactly. There's a strong interpretive link. The 144,000 are often seen as synonymous with, or the group from which the two witnesses emerge, or perhaps the two witnesses represent the collective ministry of the 144,000. They, along with the concept of the woman, the faithful church remnant, fleeing into a place prepared by God in the wilderness, Revelation 12, are supernaturally protected and sustained throughout the entire 12,260 days, the 42 months of the beast's reign. They operate in a sphere the beast harlot cannot ultimately destroy.
So they're not just hiding, they're active during that time of total global control. What can they possibly do against a worldwide beast government?
Their role is primarily spiritual warfare, but it's incredibly powerful according to the sources. While the harlot system is busy persecuting and martyring other believers and enforcing beast worship, the two witnesses, representing the 144,000 remnant, are prophesying. What do they prophesy? The eternal gospel, yes, but also fierce warnings against taking the mark of the beast and exposing the lies and corruption of the Babylon harlot system. The sources use strong language. They say the witness's ministry will crush the harlot's power, not militarily, but spiritually and doctrinally. They operate with divine authority, challenging the beast's claims, rallying the faithful, and maintaining a testimony that the harlot, despite her global reach, cannot silence or overcome in that specific protected sphere.
So the 42 months isn't just quiet oppression. It's this intense backdrop of global tyranny versus focused, protected spiritual resistance.
Precisely. It's described as the ultimate period of polarization. Apostasy and persecution on a global scale, countered by divine protection and potent spiritual warfare waged by this sealed remnant, the two witnesses. It is the absolute crucible, the Great Tribulation.
And what brings this 42-month standoff to an end?
The end comes with the sounding of the seventh trumpet. Revelation indicates that when the two witnesses have finished their testimony, meaning their 12,260-day ministry of prophesying and spiritually crushing, the harlot is complete. The seventh trumpet sounds. This trumpet signals a monumental shift. The kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of Christ, and crucially, it triggers the first resurrection. All the saints who are martyred during the tribulation, along with the faithful remnant who survived the 42 months, perhaps the 144,000 two witnesses themselves, are resurrected or transformed and caught up to meet Christ in the air. This event effectively removes all righteousness, all divine restraint from the earth.
Leaving only the wicked behind.
Leaving only the wicked, those who fully sided with the beast and the harlot, to face the final, undiluted outpouring of God's wrath, the seven bowl judgments described in Revelation 16. The time of grace, the time of testimony is over. Only judgment remains.
Okay, that's covered a huge amount of complex interpreted prophecy. Let's try to wrap up the core elements for everyone listening. The central disagreement we explored is really about when you pinpoint the start of the final decisive World War III.
Right. Is it the initial catastrophe, the second seal, the red horse with the great sword, kicking off the death of the first quarter and all the subsequent chaos? That's viewpoint 1. Or is WWIIA the climactic catastrophe? The sixth trumpet? The unleashing of the 200 million horsemen, delivering the final devastating blow that kills the next third of humanity and directly ushers in the beast's rule. That's viewpoint two. It's a debate about which wave of destruction gets the official WWSOAII label, but the overall devastation is immense in both scenarios.
But regardless of the starting point, the end result described in these sources is identical. Massive, almost unimaginable global death, that cumulative loss of roughly half the world's population, 14, then 13 of the remainder, followed by the complete collapse of the nation-state system.
Yes. That destruction is the non-negotiable prerequisite for the rise of the final global power. The 42-month, 1,260-day reign of the beast government, controlled politically and religiously by the Babylon harlot figure. During this time, international warfare ends, replaced by an enforced peace focused solely on persecuting those who resist the beast's authority.
The sequence is locked in. Judgment leads to war. War leads to global chaos, famine, plague, mass death. Chaos allows the rise of unified global power, beast harlot, which then leads to focused persecution, ultimately followed by final divine wrath. And the whole point of WWIEC, of this interpretation, is to break the existing world order so completely that humanity accepts this final totalitarian system.
Precisely. It's presented as the necessary crucible to forge the conditions for the Antichrist's brief global reign.
So thinking about all this, the endpoint described is this radical shift from a world of competing nations, diverse economies, separate militaries, to a single, unchallenged global authority. An authority where the main focus isn't geopolitics anymore, but religious compliance and persecution.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to really chew on. If this prophetic interpretation holds, and the ultimate destination is this transition from our current messy, multipolar world to a single, spiritually focused, totalitarian power, what kind of shifts would need to happen in our current world to make that even remotely possible? Think about it. What would need to break in terms of global finance, supply chains, national allegiances, even military structures, for every nation to eventually submit to one beast system, ridden by one harlot ideology? How does the world get from the kind of chaos we see glimpses of today to that very specific state of enforced global totalitarian peace focused on worship? That transition from many competing powers to one unchallenged authority is perhaps the most critical mechanism implied by this prophetic clock. What facilitates that final consolidation?